in 1976, in the school students who were taught in Afrikaans, of course the language of the oppressor, they organised a campaign to boycott classes and organised marches. And then in southwest, in Soweto, which was the southwest township in Johannesburg, you had the terrible, they had the Soweto uprising, where first of all the police killed one 13-year-old student, and then when you had mass marches and protests, in the end what they did was effectively indiscriminately kill anyone they could. 600 people were killed, about 4,000 were injured in that movement, what was called the Soweto uprising. From that, a whole number of youth at that time actually left South Africa, and they swelled the ranks of the MK externally and became involved in the guerrilla movement. But nevertheless, we have to see the other side of this. And what we have to understand was that this nevertheless led to an impasse, because at the end of the day, it was unable really to shape the South African state. And I want to explain this quite carefully, because it's very important in understanding both Mandela, but also it leads us to where we are today. Now, dominant in the movement, and this had come through a whole historic period, in the ANC was the South African Communist Party. And even though Mandela was not a member of the Communist Party, in many things his views coincided with it, but also because they were the most organised force, and particularly in the ANC, they really were the driving force politically. Now, the policy of the South African Communist Party and ANC was heavily influenced by the idea of guerrilla wars being the way that effectively apartheid would be defeated in South Africa. And this was based historically on looking what had happened in China, but also looking at that stage what was happening in Vietnam, also in Cuba, and particularly because adjoining South Africa there was Rhodesia, where of course there was a war going on against first of all Britain, and then later the local regime which had declared its unilateral declaration of independence, but also particularly right on the borders of South Africa, also Mozambique and Angola, which were Portuguese colonies. Now the Communist Party also had, and this was part of, as comrades might know, part of its very general theory, which went back to the period of degeneration after the Russian Revolution, of this idea of what they called the stages theory. And what this basically said was that the ANC and anyone struggling against apartheid effectively had to ally themselves with what they called the democratic capitalists, because it was premature to talk about socialism, but instead to get rid of apartheid they had to get all of the alliances they could, and that included finding that democratic section of the capitalist half. And of course the question of socialism had to be left to an unspecified date in the future. Now this was even reflected if one actually reads, I mentioned that very famous, as I said, very touching speech at the Rivonia trial where Mandela defended himself. He nevertheless quite explicitly said that the aim of the ANC was not to get rid of capitalism. And he justified the clauses in the Freedom Charter I mentioned about by saying this was aimed at foreign capital. It was really getting rid of foreign capital so domestic capitalism could thrive. I have to say that because if you read the actual meeting where the Freedom Charter was instituted, the people who did it, the delegates who moved it, the people who seconded it and spoke to it, very definitely were saying, without any question of a doubt, that they stood for socialism and for nationalisation. So this really, you could see, was unfortunately a distortion made, particularly as I said, by the Communist Party's incorrect view. But the main focus of the ANC's work then was this armed struggle. And really what they were saying was that even if this didn't overthrow the regime, what it would do was it would put pressure on the regime by disrupting particularly foreign investment in South Africa, and then together with foreign pressure through trade boycotts and so on, that this would get concessions and then at some stage lead to the end of apartheid. So really, it was a strategy which called for guerrilla war externally, particularly externally based, which would disrupt the economy and then allow, through pressure exerted by various powers, both internally and externally, to end apartheid. Now, our comrades, and we were organised, we were members of the ANC, we were organised in a tendency which was called the Marxist Workers' Tendency inside the ANC. We were small in number, but actually were very influential, particularly in certain fields. In the trade union field, for instance, the trade union affiliated, which was the only really black trade union confederation called SACTU. It was our comrade, for instance, who was the editor of the journal of that, and we were particularly influential, as I said, theoretically and in the trade union side. What we said was this. We said that South Africa was considerably more developed than countries even like, say, Mozambique and Angola, with a very significant working class. And we said it was mass struggles, particularly ones that involved the working class, that would need to be the main focus, and therefore the main target of what the ANC should do should be to build up the forces and organisation of the masses and the working class in particular. Also, we said, although there were minor differences between different sections of the capitalist class, the struggle against apartheid, because it would involve the working class fighting for its rights, would inevitably take on the capitalist class as a whole. And the idea of having stages that divided off struggle against apartheid with the struggle for socialism was a false one. We didn't oppose the question of an armed struggle in principle, but pointed out that in practice, that it would not achieve the aims it did, because it precisely actually took the struggle away from the masses. It also pointed out it would be impossible to control. They had a very good policy when they started off. They said that it was not directed against people, it was against economic targets and so on. But actually what happened, for instance, the famous case 1983 called the Church Street bombing in Pretoria, where what happened was there was a bomb that was directed against a military installation, but it went off in the middle of Pretoria, and it killed about 19 people, injured over 200. And of course, things like that, we pointed out, could be used by the regime effectively to say, well, here we are, this is just a group of terrorists, and even to get not just support from white workers, but even sections of black working class as well. So basically then our task was to try to win over, particularly the rank and file of the ANC, to these ideas. In Coventry we were very fortunate and privileged. We had a particular role to play, and that was because there was a number of reasons. At Warwick University there was a thing called the South Africa Project, to which a number of people who were exiles from South Africa were concentrated, including two of our leading comrades who were in exile. And it also then attracted many other people came to Warwick or around Warwick through this. For instance, Nelson Mandela, who was Thabo Mbeki, who was the last president, his younger brother came here. Many others, I might tell you about some of them later on if we have time. And one of our roles here was actually we were allocated the task of people who came here to help train them up, both theoretically and so that when they could go back to South Africa. So what would typically happen, I can remember a number of cases like this. There was one guy who we never used any real names. He was called Mike, and what happened with him was, what used to happen, because there was a lot of external political pressure which the South African regime did heed. If things became too embarrassing, what they did was they would just exile people, because they thought, well, if they're out of the country, you know, they're no longer going to be a problem internally. And this comrade, he was taken from jail in the middle of the night. All he had was his boxer shorts. He was just thrown on a plane, and then he was flown to the UK. So one of our roles, as I said, was to help people like this and help to discuss with them and so on. At the same time, what we had to contend with, both within South Africa but also internationally, was, of course, the terrible bureaucratic heritage of the Communist Party, and its aim, which it always had, to control all movements and not really to want any movement that it wasn't completely in control of. And this was a big detriment to the struggle. One of the very interesting campaigns we had, which was called, it was about direct links, because what we said was the best way to get workers' support for workers in South Africa is to get workers here to talk to workers there and set up these direct links. But because this was not under their control, because this would be something which would actually be worker to worker, it's something they didn't want. And I can remember well, maybe some other comrades who were involved at the time can remember this, that there was the anti-apartheid movement, which again I won't say very much, which was the big movement which organised a whole number of things, including Coventry. We attempted to stop the Springboks rugby team playing at Coundon Road, and we almost succeeded. In fact, there's a huge demonstration there. But the anti-apartheid movement was one of those, was the main organisation which did this. And what used to happen at the conferences was that we would move a resolution saying direct contact, and everyone said this is a good idea. And then what would happen was that the leadership would wheel out these people who were ANC guerrilla fighters, and they would say, well, this is a good idea, but there's a lot of dangerous things, you guys don't really know it, we don't want workers to be exposed possibly to attacks from the regime and so on, leave it to us. And that, again, as I said, so they made every attempt really to stop the development of working class links. Now, it would have been possible for this situation, as I said, which was increasingly bloody with the various massacres taking place, to continue almost indefinitely, because what happened was that you had these mass upsurges, and you had the fantastic, it showed the heroic instincts of the working class and the people of South Africa, that despite all of these massacres, then very quickly the movement would recover. But at the end of the day, as we have pointed out, this still did not threaten the basis of the regime, and it could have continued like this, albeit in a very bloody fashion.